Okay, because we're in California, so this is the time to plant. I've decided that gardening is the best hobby in the world because you can not only create something beautiful around your own home, but you can provide a native corridor for birds and bees and other insects, assuming you're not using pesticides and herbicides, and maybe even bridge that with other enlightened neighbors and even bridge that to other open spaces to help the local environment. And then ultimately, we're actually helping in a tiny, tiny, tiny way the global environment by planting trees and having carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere and put into the soil for potentially thousands of years. So if that isn't enough to get you to get a second cup of coffee and listen and start planting, then I don't know what is. So my goal for the garden may be different than yours, but my goal is to have as many thriving, healthy, locally native plants growing initially with input from me, but later with minimal input from me because I'm going to get old and or I want to pay attention to another part of the garden and want them to be on their own two roots. Um, as I said before, the leaves of a plant do bring in carbon dioxide in the act of photosynthesis and lock it into woody forms like cellulose or food forms like starches. The leaves are also food for caterpillars, and birds like your bird feeder and they like seeds, but what they really want is like a teenager, they want a steak, a caterpillar, and high nutrition. The roots make your soil permeable to water and resistant to erosion. So roots make for healthy soil. Flowers provide the Gatorade for insects, the nectar, and for hummingbirds. And pollen would be their protein source for food to cross-pollinate. So that's the payment for pollination. And then when a flower has been pollinated, you don't have to deadhead because it's not dead. It's only done half its job. It will mature to seeds, and some seeds are surrounded by fruits, which entice other animals to carry around and have seed dispersal, or are just plain good food. And plus, flowers are pretty. So here's the locally native showy milkweed, which is just spectacular. And why it got the common name weed may be pejorative because the colonists thought anything growing native was weedy and everything they were used to was more important. But we can be enlightened from that prejudice. So I learned about a new term, which I hope will actually have some traction, and that's the symbiocene. So we have seen the um, disasters of the Anthropocene, the human changes in Earth's ecosystems with droughts and floods and hurricanes and et cetera, et cetera. So an Australian philosopher and environmentalist has coined a new term, and that's to have an eye towards, your antenna towards working with nature instead of against nature and have an interdependence with ecosystems. And that's the way I like to approach my gardening, and I'm sure that some of you do also. So if you plant a mere 30 million trees, you might get a Nobel Prize, as did Wangari Maathai did in 2004. She did not personally plant 3 million trees across 20 countries in Africa, but she inspired the Green Belt movement to have cottage industry nurseries make seedlings and plant trees. And it really has made a huge difference in that part of the African continent that she has touched. So gardening in a smaller way can be a miniature endeavor. And I read on the MIT climate portal, just out of curiosity, what it would take to offset my personal carbon emissions, and that is 640 trees. So not that many gardens can accommodate 640 trees, but that's all the leaves that it would take to bring in the carbon dioxide that spews out. Even an electric vehicle, that's the equivalent of 100 miles per gallon. The electricity comes from somewhere. So we all can think about our carbon footprint with our hobbies, and gardening is a good one. So when you think about gardening, you can think in botanical terms, monocot, dicot, angiosperm, gymnosperm, all these crazy multi-syllabic words. But you can think of gardening terms simply as a tree. A tree generally has one trunk and can be quite tall, hundreds of feet tall, which would be not appropriate for a small garden, but trees can come in small, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So 20-foot trees. Shrubs are technically different than trees. They tend to have multiple branches come out of the ground. So they can be pruned to look like a multi-trunked tree and really work well as a tree substitute in the small garden, or they can be in a hedge or a hedgerow, a multi-species hedgerow, where they have leaves all the way down to the ground, where a tree would have an understory. And some ground covers are actually just short, squatty shrubs or sub-shrubs, and they have a woody component. You have to watch them in places where people tend to cut corners because they can snap off a branch. So you want to have, that's where down on the list, grasses, perennial bunch grasses are excellent for corner cutters or places where dogs run around because they can take the abuse. I mean, heavens, they took the abuse of bisons running around for millennia. So they can take an errant Grubhub person bringing your dinner. Perennials can be herbaceous, meaning have no woody components, and some of them completely die down in the winter, so they completely disappear. And you're like, wow, all my milkweeds are dead. There's absolutely nothing here. It's a bare patch. And then come April or May, they reemerge. They actually emerge quite late, so you can be worried for a long time. But other perennials are around all year long. Vines are great for a small garden because you can get a lot of leaf cover and a lot of pretty flowers on a fence. And it can take up 6 inches of your garden where you can get a lot of coverage. Turns out you're having a talk on bulbs, so I will leave the bulb discussion to that expert. And flowering annuals are just a blast in the spring, so you can collect seeds and kind of augment your collection of them. So when you're thinking about the whole garden, you're going to have a place for each of these kinds of plants because you're basically making a sculpture, you're making a scape that they can all live in happily, and you can actually walk around and look at it too. So before you choose a plant, you have to do, I'm advising that you do, some homework. And that is to have the right plant in the right place. And the simplest way to think of it is a 4-square grid, like Foursquare we used to play. Does it like sun? A full sun plant means direct sun for at least 6 hours during the day. So if you're outside reading a book and for 6 hours and you have sun on you the entire 6 hours, that's where you would plant a sun plant. Then you can have dappled shade or deep shade. Plants that are accommodated to sun have lots and lots of modifications through evolution to tolerate that much sun. Generally small leaves, light in color so they reflect. Sometimes the leaves have a little fuzzy fuzz on them, so it reduces wind shear and evaporation. So they are meant for sun and they'll die in the shade. And then conversely, plants that are accommodated to shade, larger leaves, any ray of sun, they're like, oh, thank you. And they will just wither and die in the sun. So sun, shade, clear distinction. Water requirement, low water requirement or high water requirement. We're generally tuned into accommodating to our summer dry climate, our Mediterranean type climate. And on top of that, there's intermittent drought. So we generally are choosing plants with a low water requirement. Now they need water and they need water initially, but you can, once mature, water them once a month or once every 14 days, much lower water requirement than a traditional ornamental garden plant. And of course, size, height and width. You don't want to overplant and have a plant too tall and have to trim it all the time. And I want you to expand your choices because people and I do it myself, you're going to go back to your old favorites, but there may be a perfect plant for a problem location in your garden. So you learn about some more plants. And that is one fun part of doing your homework. And then keep a plant list. Oh, wrong list. So here's just a teensy snippet of my plant list. I have 225 species and varieties on it now. And I'm just starting. No, just kidding. So when I plant a plant, I either keep the tag or I take a picture of this sticker and look it up and find out a little bit more about the plant. Genus, species, cultivar, common name, family name, where it is in the garden, and anything special about it, including its secret superpower that may not be apparent right at first. It's like the dorky kid in 7th grade that you thought was weird and then turned out to be a great person helping you with their homework. Some plants really have some great characteristics. So one saying is don't fight the site. So if you have sun or you have serpentine or you have alkaline soil, you've got to do enough homework to have a plant that's going to be happy in that environment. And there's certainly a lot of plants that love clay soil or love sandy soil. You can amend a container, you can amend a raised bed, but I've never seen a whole garden be amended because the gophers are going to turn over the soil and the earthworms are going to turn over the soil, and everything that you amended with, it's really going to go back to what was actually there. So live with it. Love the one you live. But you don't have to feel constrained because there's so many plants to choose from. So this gorgeous, gorgeous plant is the Western redbud. It's actually in the pea family, but it's a tree. It's not, something you'd eat for dinner. But the remarkable thing about it is that the flowers actually can be erect on main branches and the actual trunk. I mean, it's just amazing in the spring. And then it's embellished by a pipe vine swallowtail butterfly. So this is just one heart-shaped leaves too. It's really cute. So go in your homework phase to have an open mind. For example, I'm not going to consider anything deciduous, but if you have a backyard when the sun is low in the winter and barely crests the hill, you might want deciduous trees because you want some sun in the winter, or silhouette against a sunrise or a sunset. So they're don't knock it out of hand immediately. And then all your productive trees, most of your productive trees, apples, pears, persimmons, stone fruit, I mean, they're all deciduous with a fabulous flower show. So don't knock anything out initially, and don't necessarily jump to conclusions. For example, my garden is being devoured by some insect. I just let the insects eat. I encourage the nibblers. When I see a leaf that's got holes in it, I'm like, great, there's someone here that's healthy enough to chew a hole in a leaf. So birds absolutely need insects to survive. Healthy plants will outgrow the nibblers, so you don't have to do all the weeding. Other insects eat the fallen leaves, so they're called shredders, and they start the cascade of making new soil. And when you have a plant that no insect can eat, it's going to take over a hillside and be a weed like Scotch broom and French broom and stuff like that. So consider them your little personal weeders. And when you do spray them, let's hope that you don't, the survivors are going to be the resistant ones. And the predators, like this lovely praying mantis, is going to be going to ramp up their population much more slowly. So Doug Tallamy, who did Speak to Sloat and has a lot of talks online, which are spectacular, had a graduate student with a little clicker count the number of trips that a songbird made to feed her brood. And she made 500 trips to get food, largely caterpillars, for her brood. Now the male made 200 trips, but who's counting? So you want to expand your options, but how do you do that? I mean, do you just walk around and see what's cute in the nursery? Well, that's one way, but you can also do it a little more objectively and use a matching site, a plant matching site, which is called calscape.org. landscaping in California, calscape.org. And in your advanced search option, you can pick as many parameters as you want and look at all the choices. And you also see the natural range of where a plant is to be found. And you're like, wow, if it's found in the natural range without anybody even gardening it, maybe, my lazy gardener or I have to, work, et cetera, gardener, maybe it might have a higher success rate in my garden. So that is a wonderful, wonderful site that people should, I'm advising people play around with. You're going to learn a lot. But once you get a plant list that's long, you need to hone your choices. So I think Jen gave a talk on design. Size is very important, your mature height and your width. Here's an oak tree. This is a native coastal live oak, Quercus agrifolia, that's across the street from me. And I don't know when it was planted or when PG&E put up their lines, but it's going to get its new divot of a PG&E haircut. And you really don't want to do that. So plant something different, something smaller. And then once you really get into design, of course, you're going to talk about shape and color and all the artistic stuff. But size is number one to consider. And then I always like to find out why a plant is super enticing. For example, there's a native sage called Lepichinia fragrans, or fragrant pitcher sage. So it's not a salvia. That's one genus of sages, but there's other genuses. And that flower is actually as big as your thumb. It's not small. And to me, the leaves smell like minted grapefruit peel. They're just wonderful. Another plant with a secret power that may not be apparent in the nursery because it's just a green blob is the Pacific wax myrtle. And its secret power is that it is most famous for withstanding wind up to 80 miles an hour without losing leaves or dying. So oftentimes it can be planted next to a freeway with 18-wheelers going by at 80 miles an hour, making all these eddy currents. And the reason it's called a wax myrtle is because the seeds are encased in a berry in the fall, and it actually contains wax that was melted down to make candles at one time. But one important thing to think about, and you can look up plants that would be appropriate for your garden that are considered keystone species. Keystone species have major superpowers. They support lots and lots of insects and lots of birds. So their size is, their contribution is outsized by the amount of space they take in your garden. And the native oaks, and some oaks are really small. They can be shrubs or 20 feet tall. People don't have to have giants in their backyard. The native prunus species, which are beautiful, Prunus ilicifolia is a native plum, and a lot of the willows that go through the summer without any water. They like to be established near water, but then they can withstand very low irrigation once established, and little tiny buckwheats, wild buckwheats. So keystone species. And some are as small flowering plants, like these native buckwheats. So lots and lots of host plants, meaning caterpillars eat the leaves to turn into moths and butterflies and turn into baby bird food. So according to Audubon and all the bird people, 96% of our terrestrial birds rely on insects, not your seed bird feeder. And these insects rely on our keystone species. So there's actually a website for that in the references. So lots of things to think about when you're doing your homework and making your initial plant list. So basically, I want you to learn all about the plant you're going to plant and fall in love with the plant before you actually do the planting. But there's a learning curve to gardening, and you can have early failures where it just doesn't take right when you plant it, or late failures. And that's what we want to mitigate and have a little less frustration. So the actual planting, after you've done all your homework, is clearing the area of weeds and debris, digging a hole, filling it up with water and letting it drain, and hover over it for a while until it's on its own roots. And cross your fingers. because things will hit it. I have a gopher problem, so I trap gophers and don't keep up quite with their diet, so I'll see plants disappear. But you can mitigate late losses by right plant, right place. 1 gallon plants are great. 4-inch plants are even better. So small plants, I plant oaks from acorns. And then one thing is, if you're not quite sure what plants will like one area in the garden, try 3 different species, a couple plants each. So that's not that much of a gamble, and see which ones are really happy and plant more of the really happy ones. The other ones move to another place in the garden. So even if you've done your homework, sun, shade, moist, dry, and size, there may be some chemistry in the soil or something that's not going to suit them. So they may want a different part of the garden. So you're going to have some flexibility and some experimenting. If you have your heart set on one species, you really, really want one plant in the garden, I would suggest trying it in a couple different places in the garden and embellishing it in the place it likes best. So 2 different concepts. One area, a couple different species, see which one is really going at it, plant more of that, versus one plant spreading it around and seeing where it's really preferred. So you do have lots of information on the website I mentioned earlier, calscape.org, and talking about, basically planting the plant that would have been there had you not bulldozed your pad for your house. So I tend to like to garden with a more natural hand in blobs, in organic drifts, because if one plant dies or one plant gets eaten by a gopher, the drift changes shape, but it doesn't look like, someone knocked a front tooth out. And another plant can kind of take over, because there's going to be insects and gophers, frost, heat, fungal disease, viral disease, bacterial disease, all sorts of things are going to hit your plants. Whenever you have a plant really, really succeed, you can just do your little happy plant dance. So a lot of books are going to rewilding and the beauty of the wild and mimicking what you would see in Yosemite Valley or some other spectacular place. I'm seeing this type of garden as a little retro. Because if one plant is dead in the middle of that hedge, it's going to look really stupid. There's not a lot of biodiversity. There are flowers in the background, but that's for 2 weeks of the year. The other 50 weeks, no flowers, no pollen, no nectar. So it doesn't really speak to me or to the environment. But that's a style thing, and people can have different styles. But it would technically be considered a green desert. So the actual planting. So the hardest thing for a new gardener to do is to space appropriately. They squish it in because in the nursery, those 1 gallon pots are absolutely touching each other and they look great in that setting. And then you're going to spread them out every 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, and it'll look like someone will come to the garden after you planted and they're like, "What did you do today?" So you got to space appropriately for the ultimate size of the plant. And there is different advice, but I tend to like the advice of Greg Rubin, who writes the books that are in the reference, and to dig the hole to be actually the ultimate depth that you want it, not deeper and fill it back in. Because if it's deeper and you fill it back in with dirt, it'll settle. Because you want the crown of the plant to be just over the native soil level, but you want it wider than the plant so you can fill back into the dirt. So once you've dug the hole, fill it with water, let it drain completely. That may take an hour, it may take 6 hours. But you want to really saturate that area of soil. Oh, my dog hears something. Then take your plant out of the pot. You can loosen your roots with your fingers. It's not advised to cut them, but you can loosen out the outside edge. Set it down and then backfill. And you actually want that hole bigger because when you're backfilling, you're going to put your fist and you're going to compress the soil layer by layer by layer as you're filling in the circle around the plant up to the top. And because you need soil root contact, if you have a big 1/2 inch gap to a root hair, that's the Grand Canyon. It's not going to get any minerals or any water. So you actually want to compress this, not with, a backhoe, I mean, not with a tractor, but with your hand, compress that soil. So you really want it compressed in there. And then you water a huge circle, I mean, 1 foot beyond the drip line. And this is not a typo. It is recommended the initial watering is 10 to 30 gallons, depending on your soil and the size of the plant. If you're planting an area like a 10 by 10 foot planting bed, you can just put on a hose end sprinkler and sprinkle it overnight till the next morning. But you want that soil completely saturated, completely moist down to 18 inches. And you can mulch the plant. You don't mulch up to the root, up to the actual trunk of the plant. You want to stay 6 inches away from the plant because you don't want crown rot. So you want an area of bare soil immediately around the plant, but you can mulch everywhere else. So this is a spade, and you can see at the top edge, the metal is folded over. So you can put your foot on it, and you're not having a sharp edge on your boot, and you can actually pry soil. And for little 4-inch plants or filling in your vegetable garden or something like that, this is a soil scoop, and it's got serrated edges. And so you can scoop out a little hole and sneak in a little 4-inch pot really easily. I use these two tools almost exclusively. So here's a picture, a photograph from a book. And it's from Greg Rubin's book, Drought Defying California Gardens. So here he's set out his plants, which looks ridiculous. He's got some 4-inch plants and he's got some 1-foot plants, but he knows the ultimate size. So the plant is going to be 6 feet in diameter at maturity. You plant 2 plants 6 feet apart because one's going to go 3 feet from the center out, and the other one's going to go 3 feet from the center out. So you actually want them 6 feet apart. So it looks a little ridiculous, but it's the right thing to do. And that's a bare area. So I would, since this is fall, broadcast the whole area with wildflower seeds, so people don't laugh at you come spring. No, just kidding. And let's say you are planting a 10 by 10 foot area. If the mature size of the plant is 1 foot and you're planting them 1 foot apart, that's 10 feet, 10 plants this way and 10 plants this way. That's 100 plants for a 10 by 10 foot area. I mean, that's a lot. And if the plant that you chose has a mature size of 2 feet in diameter, you might at first think, oh, I only need 50 plants, but you actually only need 25 because you're planting 5 plants across a 10-foot span because it's every 2 feet and 5 down. So 5 times 5 is 25. If they have a mature diameter of 5 feet, that's only 4 plants. But if you plant them like a tic-tac-toe, and you imagine you don't have the mature plant now, you have this tiny dot in the center, you're going to have these bare sight lines. So generally what landscapers do, just like in the previous picture, is they stagger them. So the open area is smaller, that's for weeds, or for native ground nesting bees, or for summer annual or spring annual flowers. But you also don't have, it fills in the sight lines much faster, because even if the plant just has 1 year growth, you're going to, if you're standing here and looking at it from the side view, you're going to see plant, plant, plant. You're not going to see these big bare areas. So that's the staggering. So, and you definitely want to plant just a smidge high. So the crown of the plant is a bit over the native soil height. And you can dig too deep and backfill it. Make sure you wet that and compress that so it doesn't settle down and is in a sinkhole, because you can get crown rot. And that came from CNPS planting tips. So actually some soil fell away. So root soil contact. When you backfill with the native soil that was removed from the hole, I tend to put it in a bucket, and you want to press it down and compress it with a fist. And so you fill, pack, fill, pack, fill, pack, and a little bit high. So here is an oak seedling that I started in a can that's designed for trees. So it has grooves, so it prevents circling of the roots. It has large air holes in the bottom, so that's called air pruning, so it doesn't disrupt the taproot that much. And it only has 3 leaves. And you're like, oh, that's the stupidest oak tree I've ever seen. I mean, that's like a year old. But look at the amount of root mass those 3 leaves produced. I mean, that's like, to me, infrastructure. I mean, those leaves are doing photosynthesis all year and making roots, but they need soil contact. And then it'll grow to be a big oak tree. So I'm sure that some of you might have gasped with the suggestion of 30 gallons of water for an initial watering. And so did I. But let's put it in perspective. According to what I looked up, the average US personal water use is 82 gallons a day, every day. So this is just your first watering of your plant, and 70% of that is indoors. So it's not out of the question. I mean, it's basically like having another person in your house for one day. And if you do the math, and I'm sure everyone remembers all of their geometry, let's pretend you are watering a 3-foot diameter circle. So the radius is 1.5 feet. So the surface area is pi r squared. So that's approximately 7 feet. And let's say you want to water to a depth of 18 inches. So that's 1.5 feet times 7. So that's 10 cubic feet if it was a hole, if it was like a swimming pool or a horse trough. That's 10 cubic feet, which is 78 gallons. Now you're not filling an empty hole, you're saturating soil. So soil has room for water and room for air. So you don't need 78 gallons to water a 3-foot circle, but you do need 30 gallons to really water a circle. So that allows particles to come into that area of the root hairs for contact, and also makes it so the surrounding soil doesn't steal all the water immediately and dry out your just planted plant before it gets its roots started. But CNPS recommends that. Greg Rubin recommends that. Las Politas Nursery, which is a native nursery in Southern California, has a great website. And if you have early planting loss, maybe you underwatered that first time. So I did an experiment in my kitchen, and one of the biggest issues is the surrounding soil, which is not seen rain since April, is going to steal all the water. So I took a sponge and I got it as wet as it could so I could hold it up in the air and it wasn't dripping. So it was quite wet, but it wasn't dripping, and put a paper towel next to it. And man, the water just capillary action was chasing into that paper towel. So so you're going to plant, say, this 1-gallon plant and water just that area. Well, that surrounding soil is going to take every bit of water. So your first watering is more generous than you might have initially imagined. And the other thing is that sometimes soils get hydrophobic. Like, really? I mean, like, I can understand being afraid of spiders, but soil being afraid of water, and it actually does happen. So there are natural waxes from plants and from fungi that can coat a soil particle and make it repel water. And in nature, if you have enough biologic activity, those waxes get broken down and it doesn't repel water. But if soil's been dry for a long time, or after a fire where these waxes melt, you can have hydrophobic soil. So has anyone had the experience where you have some potting soil, you want to pot a plant, and you add some water to it and it just sits on top, or the soil sits on top of the water and like it stays completely dry, even though it's in a bucket of water? You have to kind of knead it around like kneading bread, and kind of convince it to actually get hydrated. So there is a product, there is a surfactant, basically soap, that is a wetting agent if you notice that your soil is really repelling water. If you have a potted plant, you can, and that bucket seems to be too big for that potted plant, but you can soak it for a long time and get over that that hydrophobia. Sometimes if you have a plant in a container and you water it and water is immediately down the bottom hole, it's just scooted down the side and down the hole and hasn't watered the plant at all. So you do have to do some soaking. So your watering schedule is going to be different year by year. Initially, even a drought tolerant plant will appreciate water even twice a week. Second summer, once a week. At maturity, may not need any supplemental water at all, or once a month. And how do you know when a plant's established? Well, usually doubling in size, significant new growth, clearly thriving in that area. The Master Gardeners of Butte County have a lovely blog with lots of fun gardening information and beautiful pictures, which is where this came from. So sometimes you really hit the jackpot, and this is an Epilobium canum, so the California fuchsia, that was a 4-inch pot. This is like, you know, getting a designer gown at Ross or something. This is like, what do you call it? Humble bragging or something. It's a little tiny 4-inch pot, no irrigation to it, hand watered, and it's sent out at least 20 friends in all directions and is covered in flowers now that the hummingbirds love. So sometimes you don't have to plant every plant in your garden. They will propagate themselves, and you can just sit back and enjoy the show. Sometimes you can learn about native plants in your community that are absolute freebies. This is Hooker's Evening Primrose. Now, Hooker was a famous botanist. If my last name was Hooker, I might change my last name, but he didn't. And this was in an abandoned parking lot. And I waited for these seed pods to mature and broke off a few and put them in my front yard and got these great flowers. So this is a reminder to talk about responsible collecting. So from your own garden, great, go for it. With your friend's garden, with permission, go for it. But when you are taking seeds, the restoration folks recommend taking only 10% of the visible seeds. So if you have 10 seed pods, break off 1 seed pod. And if you have 10 plants, break off 1 seed pod from each of the 10 plants. So you get lots of diversity of the genes, but you're leaving 90% of the seeds for it to propagate itself or feed the birds or whatever. So you don't take everything, and obviously never take a live plant. This is a biennial, like hollyhocks are biennials. So the first year, it looks just like a weed. I mean, it's this green rosette. All the leaves come from the bottom. And the next year, you get a 6-foot tall spire in August with these yellow flowers. So sometimes you don't have to go to Sloan and buy a plant, but don't tell them yet. I don't think you can ever have too many poppies. By the way, poppy seeds are edible. They're a little hard to collect because when the seed pod, here's a seed pod, see the C-shaped seed pod. When the seed pod is mature, they explode and go all over the place, so they're hard to collect. But they tend to like gravel. So here's a poppy in an unirrigated walkway, essentially. And how it is up and in September, where it hasn't rained for I don't know how long, and it's in my garden. So, so you can always experiment with your poppy seeds by baking a lemon poppy seed loaf and bringing it to your local Sloan. So go forth and plant. Remember the saying, sleep, creep, and leap. So plants initially may not do anything the first year. They're giving that incredible root structure like I showed you with the oak. Some growth the next year, and then getting to maturity. But be patient. Here's my pile of weeds. I had extra weeds this year because of the rains, but got rid of them now. And I do have the slides are posted on the Sloan site, and anything I mentioned would be included here in references, so you can go into more detail. So open for questions.
Yes, thank you, thank you. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. You actually went over so many amazing topics that people can utilize for planting in their garden throughout the whole year, but especially this time of the year. That I pulled some questions and some ideas, but honestly, you're answering them as we go. Either way, we can kind of go over them as we talk. I want to actually go back to one thing you were mentioning when you were planting a large area and you had lots of plants kind of like more separated out, and you know they're gonna grow in and they're gonna get bigger. But you mentioned maybe the idea of broadcasting native seeds in the area to kind of give it some life and some energy and some growth throughout that season. But I kind of want to know, what's your thought process on the long-term effect of that, and what someone could expect, you know, a year down the line or 2 years down the line, and that development of the broadcasting of native seeds in an area.
Well, I mean, the wildflower seed mixes are usually spectacular the first year. You've, weeded assiduously and raked them in, or walked on them and kind of scuffled them around and stuff like that. And you might get 10 species of plants, but only like 2 or 3 of them are going to really like your garden. And the next year, in terms of reseeding, it's going to be way fewer species. And the ones that are reseeding like your garden, so go with it. I mean, I've got a lot of seedlings of the native flax, which has a beautiful periwinkle blue flower. And I'm like, okay, go for it. The other ones like that I really like, they're like, ooh, not so happy. I got a lot of Clarkias. So these shrubs are gonna, if you have like a bank and you're, gonna have a shrubby ground cover, those shrubs are going to take over and those wildflowers are going to have to find a new place to live. But only a few are going to really, really like your garden and reseed robustly. So I think they can cohabitate, and your populations will just naturally, as the shrubs get larger and larger. I mean, the best control of weeding is having a plant that you like in the garden, ground cover and shrubs, because it is going to suppress weed growth for the footprint that it's on, and the weeds are going to grow in the open area.
Yeah.
So,
No, definitely. I like the idea of, you know, if you have the area being utilized by the plants and the soils being worked and everything, the whole ecosystem is a lot stronger, but also it does reduce the amount of weeds because there's something already growing there. And if you have an area that's just completely bare with only a few little shrubs, you're going to probably promote weed growth in the area. And of course, we all know weeds are just plants you don't want, even though plants are plants, right? So sometimes you
well,
can find
weeds
one you
can
like.
be a little worse
And
than
invasive.
plants you don't want. I mean,
Mhm.
all those golden hills in California are Northern European winter annual grasses that die in April and are fire promoting. So
Mm.
weeds can be dangerous too, not just in an aesthetic point of view that you don't like them,
Very
and
true.
probably contributed to the fires in Maui too, exotic plants. So I'm a little more, you know, judgmental on how much I hate weeds.
Definitely, yeah. Um, so I also have another question that kind of came up, and it was something I was going to mention. I really appreciated, I know it's kind of funny to say, I appreciated the math, which is something I don't normally say, but going into the idea of how much actually water can go into an area, and then the description of how water actually leaches out. And we all know capillary action can pull water in different directions, but the idea that if you just water your plant, it gets pulled to the side, and you know the actual size of an area is pretty large. And so I really appreciated that kind of
Well, it was
snippet
funny
there.
because I actually forgot to add, if you're holding a 2-gallon metal watering can, it's like 20 pounds, right? I mean, you're walking around the garden and you sprinkle it around a plant, it's only half an inch of water, half an inch in a 3-foot
Mhm.
circle. And all the other soil below that is completely dry. And you're like, I just carried 20 pounds, 100 feet. I mean, it's nothing. Nothing. And you really just want the roots to go out there to find the water eventually. And also, trees do lateral irrigation. So my oak tree has roots, I don't know how far down, really far down. And everything in its drip line is happy because it gets watered all summer by the oak tree. It brings it up and then out sideways. So getting trees established is going to have many repercussions, many positive repercussions in your garden.
Yeah, I had someone who actually asked a question pertaining to that, where they were saying, They maybe planted a tree a little while ago, but they didn't really approach it in this like large amount of water at the beginning. And is it something that they have to catch up on, or what's maybe some methods for someone who maybe didn't do that actual initial watering?
If it made it, so there's initial transplant death, and then there's late death because it's not the right plant for that place, or the place changed and now it's shady or whatever. If it made it, it's got roots and you don't need to do a catch-up watering. That's a really good question. But it's it's trying to reduce your initial planting loss. So Greg Rubin describes when he started being a landscape contractor, and he's in the San Diego area, he would get a contract and have a customer and put in 1,000 plants. And then if 20% of them died, did not have a happy customer. So he sort of created this method of initial planting to have 95+% take, so this was raw experience in the field.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I have another one that I also wanted to commend you and actually thank you for explaining why we don't dig the hole much deeper than the actual root ball. Because for a long time, I learned that a little while ago, and I've kind of said it before, and I never fully understood the full reason why. And it's because it compresses down and actually can sink. And that makes a lot of sense. And actually, it shows me some reason why maybe some of my plants seem to have like more divot, because I tend to just dig a big hole, throw some soil in there, kind of do my thing. But actually make sure that soil underneath it is nice and compact to keep it up. It's very helpful. Would you be able to quickly kind of go over what the actual concept of crown rot or the idea of the top of the plant, what actually happens when it does go down? I have someone who was actually asking about mulch and how much mulch to like mulch a camellia tree or azaleas and stuff like that. And if they put too much, what can that do, or too close to the stem?
Yeah. So that folks say don't have a volcano, like where it's coming up the side and coming up the trunk. So fish and people are different. So my skin, is accommodated to air. And if I swim in a swimming pool for 4 hours, my skin is going to be a wrinkled mess, where fish are accommodated to water. So the above ground parts of the plant are accommodated to air. I mean, it can get wet. It does rain, but it is an air area. I mean, it's accommodating to air, and roots are accommodated to the environment of soil, which is air and water and mineral particles and organic particles. But if you put the soil up, or mulch, up into the air part of your plant, the above ground part of your plant, it'll die of fungal disease. So the rot is really a fungal infection, and especially in warm weather. So you can see an oak tree sitting in a low flooded field, and it's full of water, and it doesn't die because it's cold. But if that was in the summer, it would die. So warm weather and having a warm environment is just like you sitting in a warm swimming pool for 4 hours. It's not pretty.
Yeah. And so that's a good reason why you kind of want to keep that space, make sure that the trunk, which is the woodier part of the tree, is not just sitting there moist and hot and
right.
Becoming problematic. Good. I have a couple of questions coming in, and we don't have too much time, but I do want to talk about one where they're asking about you mentioned the Western redbud tree, which is a beautiful plant. I mean, the most wild, the flowers growing on the trunk is the most amazing experience when you see them. But they're talking about that they are planting on slopes, and I think the idea of what kind of trees, and they're asking if the redwood's a good idea, but what kind of trees can you plant on slopes, or maybe the idea of what kind of planting ideas for areas that maybe erosion's a problem.
Oh, yeah. So north slope and south slope. So south slope would be way more challenging because we're in the northern hemisphere and it's going to get sun. So it's hard to water on a slope because it slides down. So you need super drought tolerant plants for a slope. And if it's very, very steep, it's hard to get them established. So one cheater way is to plant at the top of the slope and have things that like to drift over. So the ceanothus and the arctostaphylos, the manzanita cousins and the California lilacs, they will drift over, and they will actually, the branches will come down and actually root and have propagate down the slope. So if you have a short slope, like 10 feet, that's super steep, I would plant at the top and let the plants come down. And so if you plant in the middle, you think it's going to be like a pancake and spread out as a circle. They won't. They'll go to the downhill. So depending on the steepness, if you can walk on it, you can plant on it. But if you can't walk on it, it's really hard to plant on it. The other trick to planting on a very steep slope is have the network of California native perennial grasses, because they are just workhorses. They can have roots that go down 20 feet, live a long time. And then you can, once they're established, then you can add shrubs. So you don't have a complete, monoculture, but they can actually tolerate that tougher environment. So we have a state flower, the poppy, we have a state bird, the quail, but we also have a state grass, which used to be called Stipa pulchra. Now it's Nicella pulchra, but it's a workhorse. It can tolerate a steep slope and bring it into submission. So the next layer of plants are a little bit happier because they're not on sheer rock.
That's amazing. I didn't know we had a state grass. I'll have to
Oh yeah.
That's really cool. That's a really good explanation of that kind of area. And I really do like the idea of looking into some of those really good native grasses and stuff that actually really make nice root structures. They're hosts for lots of different kinds of native species and stuff too.
And where people cut corners. So, because you plant a woody plant where someone cuts a corner, they're dead. I mean, it's broken. And these guys can tolerate people cutting corners. It's really good for yeah.
Definitely. I also wanted to mention, because you're talking about bringing in natives and stuff like that, just as a quick plug for our slope gardens, of course, that we are actually going into right now. If you're watching this live, we're in the middle of September, and at the very end of September we have our fall. I think it's the equinox, our fall sale. It's a really good time of the year if anyone's interested in planting some of these plants and looking into some of these things, especially natives. We're bringing a lot into our store as well. It's 25% off all of our nursery stock. So, 1 gallons and bigger. If you want some good plants, 25% off is a good reason to come to the store. But we also have a lot of nice things that we want to make sure that we can get into our gardens. I just brought in some nice natives.
Try some new species. And I know it sounds dorky. I would start creating a plant list on a spreadsheet, because you think you're going to remember the name and you won't. So
no, absolutely, I understand. And we will help you as much as we can. If you come in and try and describe a plant to us, we will help you with what we can. But if you have a species or a picture or something like that, it's a lot easier. So definitely come into the stores with a little bit of research, and we'll definitely be able to go a long way with that kind of information. I know I have a lot of different kind of questions coming up, and I wanted to thank you all for joining us today for these kinds of classes. And if you have more of them, I know I have some about camellias and azaleas and stuff. We have some amazing webinars about those. Of course, we have our hydrangea ones coming up and our succulent ones coming up. So lots of good information to come up that you can look into. I would wish that we could talk all day with you, Joan, because you have a wealth of information that I really want to just kind of pick at and get your ideas on how to plant. But everything you said today was really helpful, and I hope we can have you back again for another one. I
actually am developing a talk, which will probably have an attendance of 2, and it's explaining the ridiculous science of botanical Latin, of scientific names.
Oh, cool.
And the backstory of that, because there's some fun facts.
Nomenclature can be really exciting and kind of fun, and just really, you learn a lot about the history, and you learn a lot about the plants too.